Hi, I'm Kira. The smell of charcoal and lighter fluid still makes my stomach turn. It was supposed to be just another 4th of July barbecue at my father's house in Riverside, the kind where Diane would fuss over potato salad, and Marcus would show off his new BMW to whoever would listen. But when my dad looked me straight in the eye, beer in hand, and announced to the entire backyard that I was his biggest regret, I didn't flinch. I just smiled and kept flipping burgers. What they didn't know was that Detective Park was already parked 3 blocks away, and she wasn't coming for the barbecue. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other family gathering in the Valdez household. Diane had been up since 6, marinating chicken thighs and arranging flowers she'd picked from her prize-winning garden. The back patio was already set with her favorite tablecloth, the one with tiny American flags that she only brought out for patriotic holidays. I arrived early, carrying a cooler filled with homemade salsa and the corn salad that Uncle Vinny used to make every summer before he passed 2 years ago. My father, Robert, was already positioning himself as the grill master, wearing his ridiculous apron that read "Kiss the Cook" in faded red letters. At 58, he still carried himself like the high school football star he'd been decades ago, chest puffed out, voice carrying across the yard even when he was just asking someone to pass the salt. Diane orbited around him like she always did, making sure his beer stayed cold and his ego stayed fed. Marcus had driven over in his shiny new BMW, the 3rd luxury car he'd purchased this year, with money from his tech startup that nobody in the family quite understood, but everyone pretended to admire. He was 26, 3 years younger than me, but you'd think he was the elder sibling from the way Dad hung on his every word about quarterly projections and venture capital meetings. Natalie, his twin sister, had flown in from Portland where she worked as a marketing director for some organic coffee company. She always managed to make everything about her latest yoga retreat or meditation workshop, speaking in that soft, therapeutic voice that made simple conversations feel like therapy sessions. I kept to myself mostly, the way I'd learned to do over the years. While they clustered around the outdoor kitchen island, discussing Marcus's latest business triumph, I quietly set up the drinks station and checked that we had enough ice. It was easier this way, staying on the periphery, handling the logistics that nobody else thought about but everyone expected to be perfect. My stepfamily had never quite known what to do with me, the daughter from Dad's first marriage, who showed up every few months for obligatory gatherings but never quite fit into their carefully curated suburban success story. The thing is, I'd grown comfortable in that role, the quiet one, the one who didn't have much to contribute to conversations about stock options and property investments. They saw a 29-year-old woman who still rented a small apartment near Riverside Community College, where I worked as an administrative assistant in the academic records office. Nothing glamorous, nothing that would impress their country club friends, or make for good dinner party stories. Just dependable, forgettable Kira, handling the practical stuff while the real family members discussed their real accomplishments. What they didn't see was how carefully I listened during these gatherings. How I filed away the casual mentions of business deals and financial moves, the way Dad's voice changed when certain names came up in conversation, the nervous way Diane would redirect conversations that ventured too close to topics involving the years before she joined the family. I'd learned the art of selective visibility from my mother's brother, Uncle Vinny, who used to tell me that the most dangerous person in any room was the one everyone underestimated. Uncle Vinny had owned Morales Motors, a small auto repair shop in the industrial part of Riverside. To most people, it looked like barely more than a glorified garage with a hand-painted sign and cars in various stages of repair scattered across the lot. When he died 2 years ago from a sudden heart attack, Dad had rolled his eyes at the reading of the will when we learned that Vinny had left the shop to me. "Just what Kira needs," he'd muttered to Diane, loud enough for me to hear. "Another burden she can't handle." I'd kept the shop running with the help of Tony Rivera, Vinny's longtime mechanic who knew every bolt and wire in the place. We were nothing fancy, just honest repairs for working families who couldn't afford the dealership prices. But the shop provided something more valuable than Dad realized. It was a place where I could think clearly, away from the suffocating dynamics of family gatherings, where I was perpetually cast as the disappointing daughter who couldn't quite get her life together. The irony wasn't lost on me. While Marcus talked about disrupting industries and Natalie shared her insights about consumer wellness trends, I spent my days in coveralls under the hood of a '92 Honda Civic, learning about engines and transmissions from Tony, who'd been fixing cars since before I was born. There was something honest about mechanical work, something straightforward about diagnosing problems and finding solutions. Cars didn't lie to you, or manipulate you, or make you feel small. They either ran or they didn't, and if they didn't, there was always a logical reason why. The barbecue was in full swing by noon. Extended family members had started arriving, cousins and family friends who lived in the same social circle as Dad and Diane. The backyard filled with the usual cast of characters. Suburbanites who measured success in square footage and luxury car brands, people who asked what you did for work within the first 5 minutes of meeting you, and whose interest in the conversation visibly diminished based on your answer. I found myself manning the grill when Dad stepped away to show off his new riding mower to a neighbor. It was a role I'd somehow inherited at these gatherings, the reliable one who could be trusted with the cooking while the more important family members socialized. I didn't mind it, actually. The grill gave me something to focus on, a legitimate reason to stay slightly apart from the conversations that invariably made me feel like an outsider in my own family. Diane's sister Carol approached with her usual forced smile and glass of white wine already half empty despite the early hour. "Kira, honey," she said in that overly sweet tone that people use when they're about to say something cutting. "Still working at the college? And that little garage your uncle left you?" The way she said little garage made it sound like a child's playset, rather than a functioning business that employed 3 people and served dozens of families in the community. "Both keeping me busy," I replied, focusing on turning the chicken thighs to avoid her penetrating stare. Carol had a talent for asking questions that sounded supportive, but were actually designed to highlight your shortcomings, especially when compared to her own children who all worked in finance or law. "Well, that's nice, dear. It must be so fulfilling to work with your hands." The patronizing tone was unmistakable. She took another sip of wine and glanced around the yard where Marcus was holding court near the pool, gesticulating wildly as he explained some new app his company was developing. "Marcus is doing so well, isn't he? Robert is just bursting with pride. 3 years out of Stanford and already talking to investors about going public." I nodded and made non-committal sounds while she continued her comparison game. It was a familiar routine at these gatherings, the subtle ways that extended family members would contrast my modest life with my half-siblings. More impressive achievements. I'd learned not to take the bait, not to defend myself, or point out that contentment might be worth more than a prestigious job title. It only made them try harder to find the pressure points. The afternoon wore on in its predictable rhythm. Dad held court by the outdoor bar he'd installed last summer, regaling anyone within earshot with stories about his glory days playing semi-pro baseball and his current success in commercial real estate development. Diane fluttered between guests, making sure everyone's glasses stayed full and steering conversations away from any topic that might create tension or awkwardness. Marcus and Natalie basked in the attention of relatives who hung on their every word about their exciting careers and sophisticated city lives. And I stayed at the grill, cooking food for people who saw me as a cautionary tale rather than a family member. The designated responsible one who could be counted on to handle the practical necessities, while the real stars of the family entertained and impressed. It was a role I'd grown accustomed to over the years, even if it stung sometimes to be so consistently overlooked and undervalued. What none of them knew was that I'd been documenting their conversations for months. Not recording them, nothing that dramatic or invasive, but making careful mental notes of the casual mentions of business deals and financial arrangements that Dad discussed with Marcus, thinking I was too distracted by cooking duties to pay attention. The way certain names made Dad's jaw tighten slightly, or how Diane would quickly change the subject when someone mentioned the early years of their marriage. Uncle Vinny had taught me to pay attention to the details that other people missed. "Kira," he used to say while we worked side by side in the shop, "people show you who they really are in the moments when they think nobody's watching. The trick is to be watching without them knowing you're watching." It had seemed like simple advice at the time, the kind of thing uncles say when they're trying to impart wisdom to their nieces. But But over the past 2 years, as I'd observed the dynamics of my father's new family, Vinny's words had taken on deeper meaning. There were inconsistencies in Dad's stories about his business success. Numbers that didn't quite add up when he talked about property acquisitions and development projects. References to partnerships and investors that seemed to shift depending on who was asking and when. Nothing dramatic enough to raise obvious red flags, but enough small discrepancies to make me curious about what might be hidden beneath the surface of his carefully constructed success story. The sun was starting to sink lower in the sky when Dad finally made his announcement. He'd been drinking steadily throughout the afternoon, his voice getting louder and his stories more embellished with each beer. The family had gathered around the patio table for Diane's famous apple pie, and Dad stood up with his bottle raised like he was about to make a toast. "You know," he began, his words slightly slurred but his voice carrying across the yard, "I've been thinking about family today. About legacy. About what we pass down to the next generation." He gestured toward Marcus and Natalie with obvious pride. "Look at these two."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
Marcus with his business empire, Natalie changing the world one sustainable coffee bean at a time. Makes a father proud. The backyard had gone quiet, except for the distant sound of a neighbor's lawnmower and the gentle bubbling of the pool filter. I kept my eyes on my slice of pie, sensing where this was heading but hoping I was wrong. "And then there's Kira," Dad continued, his tone shifting in a way that made my stomach tighten. 29 years old, still figuring things out. Working at a community college, playing around with that old garage like it's going to amount to something. He took another drink, and when he looked at me, his eyes held a coldness I'd seen before, but never this publicly. "I have to be honest, sweetheart. Sometimes I wonder where I went wrong with you. My biggest regret, really." The silence that followed was the kind that makes your ears ring. Somewhere in the distance, a car door slammed. Diane made a small sound of protest, but it was half-hearted, more about social propriety than actual defense of me. Marcus stared at his hands, suddenly fascinated by his manicure. Natalie opened her mouth like she might say something supportive, then seemed to think better of it and reached for her wine instead. I looked up from my pie and smiled at my father. Not the tight, hurt smile that might have been expected, but something genuinely pleasant and unbothered. "Well, Dad," I said in a voice so calm it surprised even me, "I guess we all have our disappointments." That's when we heard the car doors slamming in the driveway. Not just one, but several, with the distinctive heavy thunk of official vehicles. Dad's face went pale despite his afternoon in the sun. Through the side gate we could see the unmistakable silhouettes of people in uniform walking toward the backyard. Detective Lisa Park appeared first, her badge clearly visible on her belt, followed by two uniformed officers whose serious expressions suggested this wasn't a social call. The barbecue guests froze mid-conversation, forks halfway to mouths, as law enforcement entered what had been a private family gathering. "Robert Valdez?" Quote, Detective Park's voice cut through the silence with professional authority. "We need to ask you some questions about your business dealings with Pinnacle Development Group, and about some financial records that have recently come to our attention." Dad's beer bottle slipped from his hand and shattered on the patio concrete. In the chaos of broken glass and shocked gasps from the family, I quietly stood up from the table and walked toward the house. Nobody noticed me leave. They were all too focused on watching Dad's carefully constructed world begin to crumble, just like I'd known it would eventually. What they didn't realize was that Detective Park hadn't arrived by coincidence. She'd been expecting this moment for weeks, ever since a concerned citizen had contacted her with detailed information about questionable financial transactions and potential fraud involving several local development projects. Information that had been carefully compiled by someone who'd been paying very close attention to casual conversations at family gatherings. Someone who'd learned to recognize the difference between legitimate business success and something much more dangerous. As I reached the sliding glass door that led into Dad's house, I could hear him stammering excuses about misunderstandings and accounting errors. Behind me, the sound of Marcus asking repeatedly what was happening, his voice climbing higher with each question. Diane was crying softly, not the dramatic tears of someone shocked by unexpected news, but the quiet weeping of someone who'd been dreading this day for a long time. I paused at the threshold and looked back at the scene unfolding on the patio. Dad, the man who'd just declared me his biggest regret, now looked smaller somehow, diminished by the presence of people who weren't impressed by his stories or intimidated by his bluster. The golden boy Marcus, usually so confident and articulate, seemed to have lost his ability to form complete sentences. And Diane, who'd spent the day orchestrating the perfect family gathering, stood frozen beside her carefully arranged flowers, watching her suburban paradise dissolve into something much messier and more complicated. In that moment, I felt something I hadn't expected. Not satisfaction, exactly, but a deep sense of clarity. The family gathering that had started with me being publicly humiliated was ending with the exposure of truths that had been hidden for years. Sometimes justice arrives wearing a badge and asking uncomfortable questions. And sometimes the person everyone underestimates turns out to be the one who was paying attention all along. I stepped inside the house, away from the chaos, and for the first time all day, I allowed myself a genuine smile. Uncle Vinny would have been proud. Inside the house, I could hear Detective Park's measured voice asking Dad to sit down while she explained why they were there. Through the kitchen window, I watched the remaining barbecue guests shuffle nervously around the patio, some already making excuses to leave early. Carol had abandoned her wineglass and was whispering urgently into her phone, probably calling her husband to report the neighborhood drama. Marcus kept pacing between the pool and the outdoor bar, his hands shaking as he tried to light a cigarette with a lighter that wouldn't cooperate. I moved through Dad's house like I belonged there, which I supposed I did, even if I'd never felt entirely welcome. The living room, with its oversized leather furniture and walls covered in Dad's sports memorabilia, felt sterile compared to the warm chaos of Uncle Vinny's old place above the shop. Everything here was chosen to impress rather than comfort, from the massive flat-screen television to the glass coffee table that nobody was allowed to actually use for coffee. The conversation outside was becoming more intense. I could make out fragments through the sliding door, words like falsified documents and money laundering and multiple properties. Dad's voice had lost all its earlier bravado, replaced by the kind of desperate explanations that people offer when they know they've been caught but hope they can still talk their way out of trouble. What struck me wasn't surprise at the accusations, but rather a sense of pieces finally clicking into place. For months, I'd been collecting mental notes about Dad's business dealings, small inconsistencies that individually seemed meaningless but together formed a pattern of something much larger and more troubling. The way he'd casually mention purchasing properties for far below market value, then selling them to development companies for massive profits just weeks later. How he always seemed to have inside information about which neighborhoods were about to be rezoned, or which lots would suddenly become available. The timeline had never made sense if you were paying attention. Dad's real estate success had exploded in the past 5 years, coinciding with Diane's brother getting elected to the City Planning Commission. Suddenly, Robert Valdez was the go-to developer for projects that other companies had been pursuing unsuccessfully for years. Properties that had been tied up in red tape for decades were suddenly approved for development, always with Dad's signature on the paperwork. I'd started keeping a simple notebook, nothing dramatic or official, just dates and details that struck me as odd during family conversations. The way Dad would get phone calls during dinner and step outside to take them, returning with information about deals that wouldn't be publicly announced for weeks. How Diane would quickly change the subject whenever someone asked about the early days of their relationship, particularly the timeline of when she'd introduced Dad to her brother. 3 months ago, I'd finally connected enough dots to realize what I was looking at wasn't just aggressive business tactics or lucky timing. It was systematic corruption, a network of insider information and falsified documentation that had been generating millions of dollars while legitimate developers were shut out of opportunities they should have had fair access to. Dad hadn't gotten successful through hard work or business acumen, he'd gotten successful through fraud. The question became what to do with that information. Confronting Dad directly would have been useless. He'd perfected the art of dismissing anything I said as the jealous complaints of his unsuccessful daughter. Going to Diane would have been equally pointless since she was clearly involved. even if she maintained plausible deniability about the details. Marcus and Natalie wouldn't have believed me, and even if they had, family loyalty would have trumped concerns about legality. That's when I remembered something Uncle Vinny had told me the last time we'd worked together in the shop, just weeks before his heart attack. We'd been replacing the transmission on a pickup truck owned by Detective Park, who'd brought her personal vehicle to us because she trusted Vinny's work more than the police department's preferred mechanics. She'd been friendly during the repair process, the kind of law enforcement officer who understood that building relationships in the community made everyone safer. That detective, Vinny had said while we cleaned our tools at the end of the day, she's the real deal. Grew up in East Riverside, worked her way through college, joined the force because she wanted to make things better for people like us. If you ever need someone who'll listen and take action, she's the one to call. I'd filed that conversation away without thinking much about it at the time. But as Dad's business dealings became more obviously problematic, and his family gatherings became exercises in watching him flaunt wealth that seemed increasingly suspicious, Vinny's recommendation took on new relevance. Detective Park had struck me as someone who would care more about justice than politics. Someone who wouldn't be impressed by Dad's connections or intimidated by his bluster. The first time I called her was nerve-wracking. I'd rehearsed what I wanted to say, but actually dialing the number felt like crossing a line that couldn't be uncrossed. When she answered, her voice was professional but not unfriendly, and I found myself explaining that I was Vincent Morales' niece, that I had some concerns about potential financial irregularities involving local development projects. She'd listened without interrupting, asked a few clarifying questions, then suggested we meet in person to discuss the details. The meeting took place at a small diner near the college where I worked, neutral territory where neither of us would attract attention. Detective Park had arrived in plain clothes, looking more like a graduate student than a police officer, but her questions were sharp and focused. I'd brought my notebook, the one where I'd been documenting Dad's suspicious business activities for months. Page after page of dates, names, transaction amounts, and property addresses that painted a picture of systematic fraud involving multiple city officials and development companies. Detective Park had read through everything carefully, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. "This is substantial," she'd said finally, closing the notebook and looking directly at me. "But building a case like this takes time. We'll need documentation, financial records, evidence that goes beyond observation and speculation. Are you prepared for what that might mean for your family relationships?" I'd thought about that question for a long time before answering. The truth was that my family relationships had been strained for years, not because of anything I'd done wrong, but because I didn't fit the image of success that Dad and Diane wanted to project. I was the reminder of Dad's first marriage, the daughter who wasn't thriving in ways that made for good dinner party stories. Protecting a family dynamic that had never really included me seemed less important than preventing Dad from continuing to defraud the city and legitimate business owners. My uncle taught me that doing the right thing isn't always easy. I'd told Detective Park, but it's always right. Over the following weeks, Detective Park had explained what would be needed to build a solid case. Financial records that showed the flow of money between Dad's company and the development projects he'd been involved with. Documentation of the timeline between planning commission decisions and Dad's property acquisitions. Evidence of communication between Dad and city officials that showed coordination rather than coincidence. Some of that evidence was already available through public records, but getting access to Dad's private financial documents would require either his cooperation or a warrant based on probable cause. Detective Park had been working with a financial crimes unit to piece together the publicly available information, but they needed something more concrete to justify the warrant request. That's where my position as the overlooked family member became unexpectedly valuable. Dad had never seen me as a threat, which meant he was careless about what he said in my presence. During family gatherings, he would discuss business deals openly, assuming I was too focused on cooking or cleaning to pay attention to the details. He kept important documents in his home office, confident that nobody in the family would think to look through his papers or question his methods. I'd never gone through Dad's private papers. That felt like a violation even given the circumstances. But I didn't need to. His arrogance made him sloppy about protecting information that should have been confidential. Phone calls taken in the kitchen while I was preparing meals, conversations with Marcus about investment strategies that revealed insider knowledge, casual mentions of upcoming planning commission decisions before they were publicly announced. The most damaging evidence had come from Dad himself, during a conversation with Marcus about expanding their business partnership. I'd been loading the dishwasher after a family dinner when Dad started explaining how Marcus could get involved in the development projects. The conversation revealed not just the scope of the fraud, but also Dad's plan to eventually implicate Marcus in ways that would make backing out difficult or impossible. The beauty of this system, Dad had said, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable, is that everybody gets dirty enough that nobody can afford to talk. Marcus gets his investment returns, Diane's brother gets his consulting fees, I get my development profits, and nobody asks too many questions about how the deals get made. I'd continued washing dishes, keeping my expression neutral, while internally cataloging every detail of what Dad was describing. The casual corruption, the way he planned to trap Marcus in the same illegal activities, the complete absence of concern for the legitimacy of his business practices. It was a confession delivered to someone he considered too unimportant to be a threat. That conversation had provided Detective Park with enough detail to begin building the warrant request. Combined with the financial irregularities her team had already identified, Dad's own words were going to be the foundation of the case against him. The irony wasn't lost on me that the daughter he considered his biggest disappointment was going to be the one who brought his criminal empire down. The investigation had moved quickly once Detective Park had sufficient evidence to justify official action. Financial records were subpoenaed, witnesses were interviewed, patterns of corruption were documented and verified. Throughout the process, I continued attending family gatherings, playing the role of the quiet, unsuccessful daughter, while actually serving as the eyes and ears of law enforcement. It hadn't been easy, watching Dad continue to flaunt his illegal success while knowing that his world was about to collapse. There were moments when I questioned whether I was doing the right thing, times when family loyalty felt more important than abstract concepts of justice. But then I would remember the legitimate business owners who had been shut out of opportunities because of Dad's corruption, the city resources that had been diverted to benefit his fraudulent schemes, the way he was planning to implicate Marcus in criminal activity without Marcus even understanding what was happening. Uncle Vinny had taught me that integrity wasn't something you displayed when it was convenient, but something you maintained especially when it was difficult. Watching Dad humiliate me at the barbecue while knowing that Detective Park was already on her way had felt like the culmination of months of careful documentation and patient investigation. The man who saw me as his greatest failure was about to learn that his biggest mistake was underestimating what his quiet daughter was capable of. Through the kitchen window, I could see the conversation on the patio becoming more official. Detective Park had pulled out a small recording device and was reading Dad his rights. Marcus had finally managed to light his cigarette but seemed to have forgotten he was holding it, ash dropping onto his expensive shoes. Diane had stopped crying and was now staring at her husband with an expression that looked more like resignation than surprise. The other guests were making their excuses and leaving quickly, not wanting to be associated with whatever was unfolding. Carol had already disappeared, probably rushing home to spread the news through her social network. The perfect 4th of July barbecue had transformed into a crime scene, complete with law enforcement officials and a suspect who was rapidly running out of explanations. I poured myself a glass of water from the kitchen tap and took a moment to process what was happening. For months, I'd been the invisible observer, collecting information and waiting for the right moment to act. Now that moment had arrived, and Dad's criminal activities were finally being exposed. The daughter he'd publicly declared his biggest regret was about to become the key witness in the case that would destroy everything he'd built through fraud and corruption. The house felt different now, less like a family home and more like evidence in an ongoing investigation. Every expensive piece of furniture, every luxury appliance, every symbol of Dad's success would soon be scrutinized as potential proceeds of criminal activity. The perfect suburban life he'd constructed was about to be revealed as an elaborate facade built on stolen opportunities and falsified documents. Outside, Detective Park was explaining to Dad that he needed to come to the station for formal questioning. His protests were getting weaker, his explanations more desperate. The confident man who had dominated every family gathering with his stories of business success was becoming smaller and more pathetic, with each attempt to justify what couldn't be justified. I finished my water and walked toward the sliding glass door, ready to face whatever came next. The quiet daughter, who had been dismissed as a disappointment, was about to step into the light and reveal exactly how much she had been paying attention all along. I stepped back onto the patio just as Detective Park was closing her handcuffs around Dad's wrists. The sound of metal clicking shut seemed unnaturally loud against the backdrop of cicadas and distant traffic. Dad's face had turned ashen, his earlier confidence replaced by the hollow expression of someone whose world had just imploded. Marcus stood frozen near the pool, his cigarette burned down to his fingers without him noticing. Natalie had retreated to a corner chair, hugging her knees like a child trying to disappear. "Mr. Valdez," Detective Park said in her calm, professional voice, "you're under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, and violation of public trust. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Diane finally found her voice, though it came out as a strangled whisper. "There has to be some mistake. Robert builds things. He helps families find homes. He wouldn't." She trailed off, perhaps realizing how weak her protest sounded even to herself. Detective Park turned toward me as I approached the group. Her expression was neutral, professional, but I caught the slight nod she gave me. It was subtle enough that the family wouldn't notice, but clear enough to acknowledge what we both knew. This moment had been months in the making, and I had been instrumental in bringing it about. "Ma'am," she addressed me formally, "we'll need to speak with all family members as part of our investigation. Would you be available to come to the station later this week?" I nodded, keeping my own expression appropriately confused and concerned, playing the role of the shocked family member, rather than revealing my actual position as a cooperating witness. "Of course, Detective. Whatever helps clear this up." Dad's head snapped toward me, and for a moment his mask of desperation slipped enough to reveal something sharper underneath. "Kira," he said, his voice carrying a warning that made my stomach tighten, "you don't know what you're dealing with here. Family business should stay family business." The threat was unmistakable, even delivered in front of law enforcement. Detective Park stepped slightly closer to Dad, her hand resting casually on her service weapon. "Mr. Valdez, I'd recommend focusing on your own situation rather than making statements that could be construed as intimidation of potential witnesses." As they led Dad away, his expensive leather shoes scraping against the patio stones, I felt a complex mix of emotions. Relief that his criminal activities were finally being addressed. Sadness for the family chaos that was about to unfold. And underneath it all, a quiet satisfaction that the daughter he'd dismissed as his greatest failure had been the architect of his downfall. The uniformed officers followed behind, carrying boxes of documents they'd collected from Dad's home office. I recognized some of the files from glimpses I'd caught during family visits, financial records, and correspondence that had always seemed too important to be left lying around so casually. Now those same papers were evidence in a federal investigation, and Dad's carelessness was going to be his undoing. Marcus finally seemed to find his voice as the police cars pulled out of the driveway. "What just happened?" he kept repeating, as if saying it enough times would make the situation make sense. "Dad's not a criminal. He's successful. He builds communities." Diane had collapsed into one of the patio chairs, her perfect hostess composure completely abandoned. The carefully arranged flowers looked garish now, too bright and cheerful for the gravity of what had just occurred. Her 4th of July barbecue had become a crime scene, and the life she'd built around Dad's success was crumbling in real time. I began clearing the abandoned plates and glasses, partly because someone needed to handle the practical details, and partly because it gave me something to do with my hands while processing what had just happened. The normalcy of cleaning up after a party felt surreal given the circumstances, but it also provided a sense of control in a situation that had spiraled far beyond anyone's expectations. Natalie approached me while I was scraping uneaten food into the trash. Her usual spiritual calm had been replaced by raw anxiety, and she looked younger than her 26 years. "Kira, you work with numbers and paperwork at the college, right?" Could there really be problems with Dad's business, like serious legal problems? The question caught me off guard, not because I didn't know the answer, but because Natalie was asking me for insight, rather than dismissing my perspective the way the family usually did. For the first time in years, someone was treating me like I might have valuable knowledge, rather than just useful hands for practical tasks. Financial investigations don't happen casually, I said carefully, continuing to clear the table. Quote, the police need substantial evidence before they make arrests. Whatever they found, it was serious enough to justify handcuffs at a family barbecue. Marcus overheard our conversation and moved closer, his earlier panic evolving into something more focused. But you don't think Dad actually did anything wrong, do you? I mean, aggressive business tactics aren't the same thing as crimes. Sometimes you have to push boundaries to be successful. The comment revealed how little Marcus understood about what had been happening right in front of him. Dad hadn't been pushing ethical boundaries. He'd been operating an elaborate fraud scheme that had generated millions of dollars through corruption and falsified documents. But explaining that to Marcus would require revealing how much I actually knew about Dad's activities, and I wasn't ready to have that conversation yet. I think, I said slowly, that the next few weeks are going to be very complicated for all of us. Diane's phone started ringing constantly as news of Dad's arrest spread through their social network. She ignored most of the calls, but I could see her anxiety increasing with each unanswered ring. The perfect suburban life she'd constructed was about to become the subject of gossip and speculation, and her carefully cultivated reputation was going to be collateral damage in Dad's legal troubles. As the afternoon turned to evening, extended family members and friends began arriving to offer support and demand explanations that none of us were prepared to give. Carol returned with her husband and a casserole, as if comfort food could somehow normalize a situation that was fundamentally abnormal. Neighbors appeared at the front door with concerned expressions and barely concealed curiosity about what had happened in their quiet subdivision. I found myself in the unusual position of being the most stable person in the room, fielding questions and making practical decisions, while the rest of the family struggled to process the new reality. It was ironic that the daughter who had been dismissed as incapable of handling adult responsibilities was now the one organizing legal consultations and managing the crisis communication. During a quiet moment while Diane was on the phone with their family attorney, Marcus pulled me aside in the kitchen. His earlier confidence had completely evaporated, replaced by the kind of vulnerability I hadn't seen from him since we were children. Kira, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be straight with me. How bad is this? The question deserved an honest answer, even if the full truth would have to wait until after Detective Park's investigation was complete. Marcus, if the police arrested Dad at a family gathering, it means they have evidence of serious criminal activity. This isn't a misunderstanding or a paperwork error. This is the kind of thing that ends careers and sends people to prison. His face went pale. But what about the business? What about my investment? I put everything into expanding the company. If Dad goes down, I go down with him. That was exactly what Dad had intended, though Marcus didn't realize it yet. The business expansion he'd been so proud of was actually a way for Dad to implicate him in the same fraudulent activities that were now being investigated. Marcus thought he was becoming a successful entrepreneur, but he was actually being positioned as a co-conspirator in a criminal enterprise. You need your own attorney, I told him quietly. Not the family lawyer, not Dad's business attorney. Someone who represents only your interests and can help you understand what you're actually involved in. The advice seemed to shock him. But we're family. We should stick together. Family loyalty doesn't protect you from criminal charges, I replied. If Dad was doing illegal things, you need to make sure you're not held responsible for activities you didn't know about. Over the next several days, the full scope of Dad's problems became clearer. Detective Park's investigation had uncovered a network of corruption involving multiple city officials, fraudulent documentation, and millions of dollars in illegal transactions. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about the arrest, complete with photographs of Dad being led away in handcuffs and detailed explanations of the charges he was facing. Diane hired the most expensive criminal defense attorney in the county, a man whose reputation was built on representing wealthy clients who found themselves in complicated legal situations. The attorney's first advice was that all family members should limit their communication about Dad's business activities and avoid making public statements that could impact the case. Marcus followed my suggestion and retained his own legal counsel, a decision that caused significant tension with Diane, who saw it as a betrayal of family unity. But as Marcus's attorney reviewed his involvement in Dad's business expansion, it became clear that I'd been right about the danger he faced. The investment opportunities Dad had offered weren't legitimate business deals. They were ways to distribute criminal proceeds and create additional layers of deniability for the fraud scheme. Natalie flew back to Portland after 3 days, unable to handle the stress of watching the family implode in real time. Her parting conversation with me was awkward, but more honest than any interaction we'd had in years. "I always thought you were just content with less," she admitted. "I didn't realize you were actually paying attention to things the rest of us missed." The comment stung a little, though I understood what she meant. My family had interpreted my quiet observation as disengagement, my modest lifestyle as lack of ambition. They hadn't realized that contentment and awareness weren't mutually exclusive, that someone could choose simplicity while still understanding the complex dynamics happening around them. As the legal proceedings began, my role as a cooperating witness became more formal. Detective Park arranged for me to meet with federal prosecutors who were building the case against Dad and his co-conspirators. The meetings took place in a downtown office building that smelled like coffee and stress, where serious people in expensive suits asked detailed questions about family conversations I'd witnessed over the past several years. The prosecutors were impressed by the thoroughness of my documentation and the consistency of my observations. One of them, a woman named Sarah Martinez, who specialized in financial crimes, told me that witness testimony from family members was often unreliable because emotional relationships clouded people's judgment. "But your notes read like investigative reports," she said. "You documented patterns and connections that most people would never notice." The preparation for Dad's trial was intense and emotionally draining. I had to review hundreds of pages of evidence, verify timelines, and prepare for cross-examination by defense attorneys, who would try to discredit my testimony by portraying me as a jealous daughter seeking revenge against a successful father. The characterization wasn't entirely wrong, though it missed the more important truth that my motivation was justice rather than personal satisfaction. Uncle Vinny's attorney, James Wright, helped me understand the legal protections available to witnesses and the potential consequences of my cooperation with law enforcement. He also helped me navigate the financial implications of Dad's arrest, since some of his assets might be seized as proceeds of criminal activity, potentially affecting inheritance or family support arrangements. The most difficult part of the preparation process was reviewing recorded conversations between Dad and his co-conspirators that had been collected through wiretaps and search warrants. Hearing Dad discuss his criminal activities with the casual confidence of someone who believed he was untouchable was painful in ways I hadn't anticipated. The man I'd grown up wanting to impress, despite his consistent dismissal of my worth, was revealed to be fundamentally corrupt in ways that went beyond disappointing into genuinely harmful. During one particularly difficult preparation session, Detective Park asked me why I'd been willing to cooperate with the investigation despite the personal cost. The question made me think about Uncle Vinny's lessons about integrity and the difference between family loyalty and enabling destructive behavior. "My dad called me his biggest regret," I told her. "But the truth is, his biggest regret should be that he raised a daughter who cared more about right and wrong than about protecting his reputation." The investigation expanded as more evidence came to light. Dad's corruption had affected dozens of legitimate business owners who'd been shut out of development opportunities, families who'd been displaced by fraudulent housing projects, and city resources that had been diverted to benefit his criminal enterprise. The scope of the damage was much larger than I'd initially realized, which made my decision to cooperate feel even more justified despite the family chaos it had created. As Dad's trial date approached, the stress on the remaining family members became almost unbearable. Diane had stopped hosting social gatherings entirely, unable to face the questions and speculation from their former friends. Marcus was struggling with his own legal problems while trying to salvage what remained of his legitimate business interests. The perfect suburban family that had once dismissed me as a disappointment was now depending on the daughter they'd underestimated to help them navigate the consequences of Dad's criminal choices. The irony wasn't lost on me that the family member who'd been seen as the least successful was now the one with the most stable life and clearest understanding of what was happening. While Dad faced federal charges and Marcus dealt with potential criminal liability, I continued working at the college and running Uncle Vinny's auto shop, living the modest but honest life that had once seemed so inadequate compared to their flashy success. The night before I was scheduled to testify, I sat in Uncle Vinny's old office above the auto shop, looking through the window at the city lights spread out across Riverside. The view wasn't as impressive as the one from Dad's house in the hills, but it felt more honest somehow, more connected to the real work of building communities, rather than exploiting them for personal gain. Tomorrow I would walk into a federal courtroom and tell the truth about what I'd witnessed and documented. The quiet daughter who had been dismissed as a regret would become the key witness in a case that would determine whether justice prevailed over corruption. Uncle Vinny would have been proud of the woman I'd become, even if Dad never would be. The preparation was complete, the evidence was compiled, the truth was ready to be told. And for the first time in years, I felt genuinely confident about the role I was playing in my family's story, even if that role was very different from what any of us had expected. The federal courthouse in downtown Riverside buzzed with activity on the morning I was scheduled to testify. News vans lined the street outside, their satellite dishes pointing skyward like metallic flowers seeking sunlight. Reporters clutched coffee cups and notebooks, positioning themselves to catch glimpses of key players in what had become the biggest corruption scandal in the county's recent history. I arrived early, wearing the navy blue suit that Uncle Vinny's attorney had recommended for court appearances. Simple, professional, forgettable. The kind of outfit that conveyed reliability without drawing unnecessary attention. Detective Park met me at the security checkpoint, her presence reassuring in the chaos of media attention and legal proceedings that had consumed the past 3 months. Inside the courtroom, Dad sat at the defendant's table wearing an expensive charcoal suit that had probably cost more than most people made in a month. His high-priced defense attorney, Richard Blackwood, had built a reputation defending wealthy clients who found themselves facing inconvenient criminal charges. Blackwood was known for his aggressive cross-examination tactics and his ability to shift blame away from his clients and onto prosecution witnesses. The prosecution team had prepared me extensively for what Blackwood would likely attempt during cross-examination. He would try to portray me as a vindictive daughter, seeking revenge against a successful father who had never given her the attention she craved. He would suggest that my modest lifestyle was evidence of jealousy rather than contentment, that my cooperation with law enforcement was motivated by spite rather than civic responsibility. What Blackwood didn't understand, and what the prosecution team was counting on, was that my testimony wasn't based on emotion or speculation. For 18 months, I had methodically documented Dad's criminal activities with the precision of someone trained to handle academic records and administrative details. My notebook contained dates, names, financial figures, and direct quotes that painted an irrefutable picture of systematic fraud and corruption. Prosecutor Sarah Martinez called me to the witness stand just after lunch, when the courtroom was still full but the morning's energy had settled into focused attention. The jury, 12 citizens from across Riverside County, looked at me with polite curiosity. They saw a young woman in a conservative suit, someone who could have been their daughter or neighbor, certainly not someone they would associate with high-stakes financial crimes. Martinez began with simple questions designed to establish my background and relationship to the defendant. Yes, Robert Valdez was my father. Yes, I attended family gatherings regularly. Yes, I had opportunities to observe his business activities and conversations. The questions were straightforward, almost boring, laying the groundwork for more significant revelations to come. Then Martinez asked me to describe what I had witnessed during family gatherings over the past 2 years. I opened my notebook, the same simple composition book I'd been carrying to family barbecues and holiday dinners, and began reading from my carefully documented observations. March 15th of last year, I said, my voice steady in the hushed courtroom. During Sunday dinner, Mr. Valdez received a phone call from someone he addressed as Tommy. After the call, he told Marcus that the Riverside Commons project would be approved by the Planning Commission the following week, 3 days before the commission's public meeting was scheduled to occur. Martinez asked me to continue. I flipped through pages of similar entries, each one documenting Dad's advanced knowledge of planning commission decisions, his coordination with city officials, and his casual discussions of fraudulent documentation. The jury's attention sharpened as the pattern became clear. This wasn't speculation or family gossip. This was systematic criminal activity, documented in real time by someone who had been present for the conversations. The most damaging testimony came when Martinez asked me to describe the conversation I'd overheard between Dad and Marcus about expanding their business partnership. I had memorized Dad's exact words because of how clearly they revealed his criminal intent and his plan to implicate Marcus in illegal activities. Mr. Valdez said, and I quote, "The beauty of this system is that everybody gets dirty enough that nobody can afford to talk. Marcus gets his investment returns, Diane's brother gets his consulting fees, I get my development profits, and nobody asks too many questions about how the deals get made." The courtroom was completely silent as I delivered Dad's words back to him. At the defendant's table, I saw him lean over to whisper urgently to Blackwood, his face flushed with the realization that his own daughter had been recording his confessions for over a year. In the gallery, Diane sat rigidly upright, her usual composure cracking as the full scope of her husband's criminality was laid bare in public testimony. Martinez then introduced physical evidence that corroborated my observations. Financial records showing the timing of Dad's property acquisitions relative to planning commission decisions. Email communications between Dad and city officials that demonstrated coordination rather than coincidence. Bank statements revealing the flow of money between Dad's accounts and the consulting company owned by Diane's brother. Each piece of evidence matched details I had noted in my humble composition book, transforming my casual observations into crucial corroboration of systematic fraud. The daughter, who had been dismissed as unsuccessful and unobservant, had actually been conducting a sophisticated intelligence operation from within the family structure. The prosecution's presentation took 3 hours, methodically building a case that left no room for doubt about Dad's guilt or the scope of his criminal activities. When Martinez finally said, "No further questions, Your Honor," the weight of what had been revealed seemed to settle over the courtroom like a heavy blanket. Then it was Blackwood's turn. He approached the witness stand with the predatory confidence of someone who believed he could dismantle any testimony through aggressive questioning and character assassination. His opening question was designed to establish me as an unreliable narrator driven by personal grievances. "Ms. Valdez, isn't it true that you've harbored resentment toward your father for years because of his success and your own lack of achievement?" The question was exactly what the prosecution team had predicted, and I had prepared for this moment extensively. "Mr. Blackwood, I've never resented my father's success. I've resented his criminality." Blackwood's confidence flickered slightly, but he pressed forward. "You work as an administrative assistant at a community college and operate a small auto repair shop. Would you describe those as successful career choices?" "I would describe them as honest career choices," I replied, "which is more than can be said for money laundering and fraud." The answer drew a sharp objection from Blackwood and a sustained ruling from the judge, but the damage was done. I had refused to be shamed about my modest lifestyle, instead turning the question back toward the real issue of Dad's criminal behavior. The jury could see that I wasn't a bitter daughter seeking revenge. I was a principled witness telling the truth about what she had observed. Blackwood tried several different approaches to discredit my testimony. He suggested that I had misunderstood innocent business conversations, that my note-taking was obsessive rather than responsible, that my cooperation with law enforcement was motivated by a desire for attention rather than civic duty. Each attack failed because my documentation was too detailed, and my demeanor too calm to suggest someone driven by emotion rather than evidence. The turning point came when Blackwood made the mistake of questioning the accuracy of my memory regarding specific dates and conversations. Martinez had anticipated this attack and had prepared a devastating response. She introduced phone records, bank statements, and email timestamps that corroborated every significant detail I had documented. Not only had I been paying attention, I had been paying attention with remarkable accuracy. "Ms. Valdez," Blackwood said, his voice becoming more desperate, "isn't it possible that you misinterpreted conversations you overheard while you were distracted by cooking and cleaning duties?" The question revealed Blackwood's fundamental misunderstanding of what had been happening during those family gatherings. "Mr. Blackwood, I wasn't distracted by cooking and cleaning. I was using cooking and cleaning as cover while I documented criminal admissions. The domestic work was camouflage, not distraction." The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs before the judge called for order. Even Dad looked shocked by this revelation. For 18 months, he had dismissed my presence at family gatherings as the unremarkable activity of his unsuccessful daughter. He had never realized that his quiet, overlooked child was actually conducting surveillance on his criminal organization. Blackwood's cross-examination continued for another hour, but it was clear that he was fighting a losing battle. Every question he asked either reinforced the strength of my testimony or revealed additional aspects of Dad's criminal behavior. By the time he finally said, quote, "No further questions," it was obvious that the defense's strategy had backfired spectacularly. The redirect examination by Martinez was brief but effective. She asked me one final question that cut to the heart of why I had chosen to cooperate with law enforcement, despite the personal cost to family relationships. "Ms. Valdez, what did you hope to accomplish by documenting and reporting your father's criminal activities?" I looked directly at the jury as I answered, speaking clearly and without hesitation. "I hope to prevent him from continuing to defraud the city, to protect legitimate business owners from unfair competition, and to ensure that Marcus didn't become a co-conspirator in crimes he didn't understand he was committing. My father taught me that family loyalty was the most important value, but my uncle taught me that integrity was more important than loyalty, especially when loyalty meant enabling harm to innocent people." When I stepped down from the witness stand, the courtroom felt different than it had when I'd entered it. The quiet daughter, who had been publicly declared a disappointment, had revealed herself to be the most observant and principled member of the family. The successful businessman who had dominated every social gathering with his confidence and charisma had been exposed as a criminal whose arrogance had made him careless about protecting his illegal activities. Dad stared at me as I walked back to the gallery, his expression unreadable but his posture defeated. The man who had called me his biggest regret now understood that his biggest mistake had been underestimating what his daughter was capable of when she decided that justice mattered more than family harmony. The trial continued for another week, with additional witnesses and evidence that further established Dad's guilt. But my testimony had been the centerpiece of the prosecution's case, the insider account that transformed financial records and email communications into a clear narrative of systematic corruption. The daughter who had been invisible at family gatherings had become the most visible and credible witness in the courtroom. During the closing arguments, Martinez referenced my testimony repeatedly, emphasizing how someone with no law enforcement training had nevertheless conducted a more thorough investigation than many professional investigators might have managed. She described my documentation as meticulous, my observations as accurate, and my motivations as admirable. Blackwood's closing argument was a desperate attempt to salvage something from a trial that had gone disastrously wrong for the defense. He continued to portray me as a vindictive daughter, but his character attack seemed increasingly hollow in light of the overwhelming evidence I had provided. The jury had seen my composure under aggressive cross-examination and the accuracy of my documentation. They understood that this was not revenge, this was justice. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all counts. Dad was convicted of conspiracy to commit fraud, money laundering, violation of public trust, and multiple related charges that would likely result in significant prison time. His co-conspirators, including Diane's brother on the Planning Commission, were convicted in separate but related trials based largely on evidence that had emerged from my testimony. As the verdicts were read, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief that the truth had prevailed, sadness for the family chaos that had resulted from Dad's choices, and underneath it all, a quiet satisfaction that Uncle Vinny's lessons about integrity had guided me to do the right thing, despite the personal cost. Dad was led away in handcuffs for the second time, though this time the setting was a federal courtroom rather than a backyard barbecue. The contrast wasn't lost on me. The man who had publicly humiliated me at a family gathering was now being publicly held accountable for years of criminal behavior. The daughter he had called his biggest regret had become the instrument of his legal reckoning. In the hallway outside the courtroom, Detective Park shook my hand with genuine respect. "Your testimony was exceptional," she said. "You should be proud of what you accomplished here." Prosecutor Martinez was equally complimentary. "I've worked with professional investigators who weren't as thorough as you were. Your documentation made this case possible." The media attention that followed was intense but brief. I gave one carefully prepared statement, emphasizing that I had cooperated with law enforcement out of civic duty rather than personal animosity, then declined further interviews. The story that mattered wasn't my individual role in Dad's downfall. It was the importance of holding public officials accountable for corruption, regardless of their personal connections. Marcus, who had testified as a prosecution witness after his attorney negotiated immunity in exchange for cooperation, approached me as we left the courthouse. His earlier arrogance had been replaced by genuine humility and what looked like the beginning of wisdom. "Kira," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology. Maybe several apologies. I never understood what you were trying to protect me from until it was almost too late." The acknowledgement meant more than I had expected. For years, Marcus had dismissed me as the unsuccessful sibling who couldn't keep up with his achievements. Now he understood that my modest lifestyle had been a choice rather than a failure, and that my quiet observations had ultimately saved him from criminal liability that would have destroyed his legitimate career prospects. That evening, I drove to the cemetery where Uncle Vinny was buried. The sun was setting over Riverside, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded me of the sunsets we used to watch from the roof of his auto shop. I sat beside his headstone and told him about the trial, about how his lessons had guided me through the most difficult decision of my life. "You were right, Uncle Vinny," I said to the gathering darkness. "Doing the right thing isn't always easy, but it's always right. And sometimes the people who underestimate you give you the opportunity to prove what you're really made of." The quiet daughter, who had been called a regret, had revealed herself to be the family member with the strongest moral compass and the clearest vision of right and wrong. The trial was over, but the real work of rebuilding honest relationships and meaningful contributions to the community was just beginning. 6 months after Dad's sentencing to 12 years in federal prison, I stood in the morning sunlight streaming through the windows of what used to be Morales Motors. The old auto shop had been transformed into something Uncle Vinny never could have imagined, but would have absolutely loved. A community resource center that provided free financial literacy classes, small business mentoring, and legal aid referrals for working families in East Riverside. The transformation hadn't happened overnight. After Dad's assets were seized as proceeds of criminal activity, the city had established a victim restitution fund using the recovered money. As the whistleblower whose testimony had made the recovery possible, I'd been asked to serve on the advisory board that determined how those funds should be used to benefit the community that Dad's corruption had harmed. The decision to convert Uncle Vinny's shop into a community center had been unanimous among board members, but it had been my suggestion. The building sat at the intersection of residential neighborhoods and small businesses that had been most affected by Dad's fraudulent development schemes. Families who had been displaced by his illegal housing projects, contractors who had been shut out of legitimate bidding processes, and small business owners who had struggled to compete against his artificially advantaged enterprises. Tony Rivera had initially been skeptical about the conversion. He'd worked in that shop for 15 years and understood engines better than he understood community organizing. But when I explained that we could keep 2 service bays operational while converting the rest of the space into meeting rooms and offices, he'd warmed to the idea. Vinny always said fixing cars was about more than mechanical problems. He'd told me, maybe fixing communities isn't so different. The grand opening ceremony was scheduled for a Saturday morning in October, when the California heat had finally broken and working families would have time to visit without taking time off from their jobs. Local city council members would be there, including the 3 new members who had been elected after Dad's corruption scandal had exposed the need for fresh leadership in municipal government. Detective Park had agreed to speak at the ceremony about the importance of community members reporting suspicious activities, though she'd made it clear that her remarks would focus on civic responsibility rather than my specific role in Dad's investigation. The media attention from the trial had died down months earlier, and I preferred to keep it that way. The story that mattered wasn't about my individual actions. It was about what communities could accomplish when they worked together to address corruption and rebuild trust. Marcus had surprised everyone, including himself, by volunteering to teach the small business development workshops. His experience with startup financing and business planning had legitimate value, especially after he'd completed a comprehensive ethics certification program and divested himself from any investments connected to Dad's criminal enterprises. The humility he'd gained from nearly becoming a co-conspirator had transformed him from an arrogant tech entrepreneur into someone genuinely committed to helping other people avoid the mistakes he'd almost made. I spent years thinking success meant making money faster than other people. He'd told me during one of our weekly planning meetings for the center. But watching Dad get sentenced made me realize that success without integrity is just delayed failure. You knew that already. I had to learn it the hard way. The relationship between Marcus and me had evolved into something neither of us had expected. We'd never been close as siblings, largely because of the different worlds we'd inhabited within the same family structure. But working together on the community center had revealed shared values that had been obscured by the surface differences in our lifestyles and career choices. He'd learned to respect my preference for meaningful work over prestigious positions, and I'd learned to appreciate his analytical skills and networking abilities when they were applied to community benefit rather than personal enrichment. Natalie had visited twice from Portland, bringing her marketing expertise to help develop outreach materials for the center's programs. Her usual spiritual detachment had been replaced by practical engagement in addressing the real-world problems that Dad's corruption had created. She'd helped design workshops on financial wellness that incorporated both practical budgeting skills and the mindfulness techniques she'd learned through her yoga and meditation practice. "I always thought you were just accepting mediocrity," she'd admitted during her second visit. "I didn't understand that you were choosing authenticity over appearance. There's a difference between being content with less and being committed to more meaningful work." The conversation had taken place while we were painting the walls of what would become the legal aid consultation room. Natalie had never been particularly handy, but she'd insisted on helping with the physical transformation of the space. Getting her hands dirty with actual work seemed to ground her in ways that her previous wellness retreats and self-improvement seminars hadn't managed to accomplish. Diane had struggled most with the aftermath of Dad's conviction and imprisonment. The suburban social life she'd built around his fraudulent success had collapsed completely, leaving her isolated from the community networks she'd spent years cultivating. Her brother's conviction on conspiracy charges had destroyed her extended family relationships as well, creating a social isolation that was both punishment and opportunity for growth. She'd eventually found work as a receptionist at a nonprofit organization that provided services to families affected by domestic violence. The job paid a fraction of what she'd been accustomed to spending on gardening and entertainment, but it had given her a sense of purpose that had been missing from her previous life as a wealthy suburban housewife. Her first paycheck had been the first money she'd earned through her own work in over a decade. "I didn't realize how empty my life had become," she'd told me during one of her visits to check on the community center's progress. "I spent so much time maintaining appearances that I forgot what it felt like to actually contribute something meaningful." The conversation had been awkward but genuine. Diane and I had never had a relationship independent of her marriage to Dad, and building one required both of us to move beyond the roles we'd played in the family drama. She would never be a motherly figure to me, but she was becoming something more valuable. A person who understood the cost of enabling corruption and was committed to making different choices. The community center's programming had developed organically based on the needs that emerged as we talked with neighborhood residents and local business owners. Financial literacy classes were the most popular offering, taught by volunteer accountants and financial planners who donated their time to help families understand budgeting, credit repair, and investment basics that could protect them from the predatory lending and fraudulent schemes that had flourished in Dad's corrupt environment. Small business mentoring sessions connected aspiring entrepreneurs with established business owners who could provide guidance on everything from business plan development to navigating municipal permits and licensing requirements. The program was designed to level the playing field that Dad's corruption had tilted in favor of those willing to participate in illegal activities. Legal aid referrals helped families access affordable attorneys for issues ranging from landlord-tenant disputes to immigration assistance to consumer protection cases. Many of the problems we encountered were direct or indirect results of the corrupt development projects that had displaced families and disrupted established neighborhood businesses. The most innovative program was the Civic Engagement Workshop Series, developed in partnership with the local League of Women Voters and designed to teach community members how to research candidates, attend city council meetings, and advocate effectively for policy changes that would prevent future corruption. The goal wasn't just to fix the problems Dad had created, but to build community capacity to recognize and address similar problems before they became entrenched. On the morning of the grand opening, I arrived early to make sure everything was ready. The October air was crisp and clear, perfect weather for the outdoor activities we'd planned in the parking lot that used to hold cars waiting for repair. Tony was already there, adjusting the microphone system we'd rented for the speeches and making sure the coffee station was properly set up. "Nervous?" he asked, noticing my careful inspection of details that were already perfect. "Excited," I replied, which was true. The past 6 months had been challenging in ways I'd never anticipated, but they'd also been deeply fulfilling. Building something constructive from the wreckage of Dad's corruption had felt like the most important work I'd ever done. Detective Park arrived with 2 other officers who had worked on Dad's case. Their presence wasn't for security purposes. They were there as community members, supporting an initiative that had grown out of their investigation. Park had become an advocate for community-based crime prevention, arguing that citizen involvement in reporting suspicious activities was more effective than increased police patrols or surveillance technologies. The first families began arriving around 9:30, drawn by curiosity about what had replaced the familiar auto shop and word-of-mouth recommendations about the services that would be available. Children ran around the parking lot while their parents examined the information tables that described each program in detail. Teenagers who had grown up getting their cars fixed by Tony greeted him with obvious affection and amazement at the transformation. Marcus arrived with a stack of professionally printed business plan templates and a nervous energy that reminded me of his earlier entrepreneurial presentations, except this time his audience was working families rather than venture capital investors. The difference in his demeanor was striking. Instead of the aggressive confidence he displayed when pitching tech startups, he showed genuine humility and eagerness to learn from the community members he'd be working with. Natalie had flown in from Portland specifically for the grand opening, bringing professionally designed brochures and a portable meditation area she'd constructed from recycled materials. Her marketing skills had proven invaluable in communicating the center's mission to diverse community groups, and her mindfulness training had helped several participants in our pilot programs manage the stress of financial difficulties and legal challenges. The ceremony itself was simple and community-focused, rather than formal or political. Detective Park spoke briefly about the importance of civic engagement and community vigilance in preventing corruption. Marcus gave a short presentation about the small business mentoring program, emphasizing his own learning process rather than his credentials. Natalie led a brief mindfulness exercise that helped ground the gathering in shared intention rather than individual achievement. When it was my turn to speak, I kept my remarks focused on Uncle Vinny's vision of community support and mutual aid, rather than the dramatic events that had made the center possible. My uncle believed that fixing things, whether they're cars or communities, requires patience, attention to detail, and commitment to doing the work right rather than doing it fast. This center exists to provide the tools and support that help people fix whatever needs fixing in their own lives and neighborhoods. The response was warmly enthusiastic, rather than dramatically celebratory. People seemed to understand that this was the beginning of ongoing work, rather than the conclusion of a crisis. Families signed up for classes, small business owners scheduled mentoring appointments, and community members volunteered to help with future programs and outreach efforts. During the reception that followed the formal ceremony, I found myself in conversation with Elena Gonzalez, a single mother whose family had been displaced by one of Dad's fraudulent housing developments. She'd enrolled in the financial literacy program and was planning to start a small catering business with support from the mentoring program. "I lost my apartment when they demolished our building for that fake luxury development," she told me. "But I never thought anything good would come from that situation. This center gives me hope that I can build something stable for my kids." The conversation reminded me why the work mattered more than the recognition. Elena didn't know about my role in Dad's investigation, and she didn't need to know. What mattered was that she had access to resources that could help her rebuild her family's stability and pursue her entrepreneurial dreams through honest work rather than exploitative schemes. As the afternoon wore on and families gradually departed with armloads of information and scheduled appointments for various programs, I felt a deep sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or vindication. Dad's corruption had caused real harm to real people, but the community's response had been to build something constructive, rather than simply punitive. Tony joined me as I was stacking chairs and cleaning up the last remnants of the reception. "Your uncle would be proud," he said simply. He always said the best way to honor people was to continue their work, not just remember their words. The comment brought tears to my eyes, though they were tears of gratitude rather than sadness. Uncle Vinny's lessons about integrity and community service had guided me through the most difficult decisions of my life, and now they were shaping programs that would help hundreds of families navigate their own challenges with dignity and support. That evening, I drove to the cemetery where Uncle Vinny was buried. The sun was setting behind the hills that surrounded Riverside, painting the sky in shades of gold and purple that reminded me of the sunsets we used to watch from the roof of his auto shop. I sat beside his headstone and told him about the day's events, about the families who had attended the grand opening and the programs that were already helping people rebuild their lives. "We did it, Uncle Vinny," I said quietly. "We turned something corrupt into something constructive. And we did it the right way, with patience and attention to detail, and commitment to helping people rather than exploiting them." A gentle breeze moved through the cypress trees that surrounded the cemetery, carrying the scent of sage and the distant sound of children playing in a nearby park. The peace I felt wasn't the temporary satisfaction of winning a conflict, but the deeper contentment of knowing that my actions had contributed to something larger and more lasting than individual success. As I drove home through neighborhoods that were slowly recovering from the damage caused by Dad's corruption, I thought about the difference between legacy and reputation. Dad had built a reputation based on apparent success and community standing, but his legacy would be the harm he'd caused and the justice system's response to his crimes. Uncle Vinny had lived modestly and avoided attention, but his legacy was the values he'd passed on and the community resources that continued his work. The daughter who had been called a regret had become the architect of her community's recovery from corruption. The quiet observer who had been dismissed as unsuccessful had proven that success measured by contribution rather than accumulation was more meaningful and more sustainable than wealth acquired through fraud. The auto shop that had seemed like a burden when I inherited it had become the foundation for programs that were helping families build honest prosperity and community resilience. Uncle Vinny's tools were still in the remaining service bays, but they were joined by computers for financial planning classes, legal reference books for the aid program, and meeting spaces where neighbors could gather to solve problems together. 6 months later, I still worked at Riverside Community College, handling academic records and administrative details with the same careful attention I had brought to documenting Dad's crimes. The work wasn't glamorous, but it was honest and necessary, and it paid enough to support the simple lifestyle that had always suited me better than luxury acquired through questionable means. The community center had become self-sustaining through a combination of grants, donations, and fee-for-service programs that generated enough revenue to cover operating costs. Tony had become the facility manager, bringing his practical skills and community relationships to the daily operations. Marcus had reduced his tech consulting work to focus more time on the small business mentoring program, which had helped launch 12 successful enterprises in its first year. Dad had been transferred to a federal prison in Central California, where he was serving his 12-year sentence with possibility of parole after 8 years. I'd received one letter from him, a brief note acknowledging that his actions had harmed people he should have protected and expressing hope that his children would learn from his mistakes. The letter hadn't asked for forgiveness or visitation, which suggested that his time in prison was providing opportunities for reflection that his years of criminal success had never allowed. I hadn't responded to the letter, not out of anger, but because there was nothing I needed to say. The justice system was handling his punishment, the community was healing from his crimes, and my life was focused on building something positive rather than processing something negative. Uncle Vinny had taught me that the best response to destructive behavior was constructive action, and that lesson continued to guide my choices. The story that had begun with a father calling his daughter his biggest regret at a family barbecue had evolved into something larger and more meaningful than personal vindication. It had become a demonstration that communities could recover from corruption when people were willing to document problems, report crimes, and work together to build alternative institutions that served everyone, rather than enriching a few at the expense of many. The quiet daughter, who had been underestimated by her family, had revealed strengths that nobody had recognized, including herself. But the real revelation wasn't about individual capability. It was about the difference between success that exploits communities and success that strengthens them. Uncle Vinny's legacy lived on not in monuments or memorials, but in the daily work of helping people solve problems honestly and build prosperity through integrity rather than corruption. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.